Please join me in welcoming Thomas Backhaus. He's a professor in ecotoxicology and environmental risk assessment. He also leads the Institute for Environmental Research at RWTH University in Aachen, Germany. And he's going to explain more about what MAF is and why we need it and if it's ready to be implemented. So Thomas, the floor is yours.
Good morning, welcome. So what I'm going to try to do within the next couple of minutes is to basically just introduce you to the MAF and try to explore a bit on why we need that and what are the issues about that. And then we will have more detailed follow-up presentations by my colleagues. So I'm not going into the regulatory details here, just the basic principles. So we have a couple of starting points. We're not starting from scratch. I think one of the reasons for concern is that environmental organisms, ecosystems, humans are exposed to complex mixtures of chemicals. We have never an exposure to just one single chemical. That is just something that doesn't exist. The problem is that a lot of regulatory approaches still assume exactly that. Not all of them, but the vast majority, and especially those that are chemical-oriented, such as REACH, for example, or the pesticide regulation. Some of those more ecosystem-oriented approaches, like the Water Framework Directive, are a bit broader, but the chemical-oriented ones are having this Achilles heel here in the approaches on how to assess chemical risks. And the problem is that the risk of a chemical mixture exceeds the risk of each individual mixture component. That is why we actually need to do something about that, because otherwise we are just underestimating the actual risk that an organism or a human being, well, it's also an organism, and or an ecosystem is actually exposed to. We know that concentration addition is a method that is actually quite well established to do that. We have dozens of studies that have been trying to poke at that concept in order to see, does it work? How far does it carry us? Where are the bottlenecks? It's a very simple concept, but it's working surprisingly well, especially for complex mixtures. And given that I don't know what kind of background you have, let me just take a detour into real life. Concentration addition is basically what you are implicitly doing when you're going into a bar and you're just having a nice evening. And what you're basically doing is you are intuitively calculating a glass of whiskey, although the dose, the amount that you're drinking, is way smaller than the glass of beer. You're basically saying that both have the same impact on your body, on your behavior. And that is basically the whole idea of concentration addition. We take the concentration, the doses of the individual components of that mixture that we are either implicitly or explicitly exposing ourselves to, and we adjust that to the potency of that poison that we're taking in. Mathematically speaking, it's very simple. I hope you can see my cursor here. We take the ratio between the concentration of a chemical and the ratio to the regulatory threshold concentration, the safe concentration. We can discuss what we mean by a safe concentration, but that's how regulation works. So that ratio, that risk quotient, gives us an idea about whether we are still in the safe zone, so to speak, or whether we are having an unacceptably high exposure. And this very simple approach actually works pretty well. So again, as I said before, it's validated. We have a lot of data on that. It really works quite well. The problem is, from a regulatory perspective, it still requires quite a few data, and especially it requires information on which chemicals are actually in the mixture. That's the big drawback, the big challenge limitation when applying this type of mixture assessment. That's a steep data requirement. We also need to know how toxic the individual compounds are. You might be arguing that with REACH, we might not be having unknown chemicals in our body or in the European environment, but far from being it. The quality of the data that is used for REACH is, let's say, questionable. I try to be polite here. It's questionable. But we also have metabolites, for example, so compounds that are not used for any purpose, but that is still out there and that we might be exposed to. So we have quite a bit of a data requirement, and the question is, what do we do that if those data are not available? So with the MAF, we basically have a new rule of thumb. Instead of doing a concentration-based assessment for every mixture, we just take a rough guess, a rule of thumb that is hopefully giving us the right ballpark figure in order to say something about the risk of the mixture that we're exposed to. And when you're starting to talk about that, that is basically the reaction of many people. So you are basically, oh, that looks interesting, but at the same time, that's really scary. So what do we do there and how do we do that? And I don't have the time to go into all the nitty-gritty details. We just published sort of an overview of what we mean by that and what are the pros and cons of that approach in Science. That was published last week. So this is just the overview figure, and that is basically what we're trying to do. So what you have in the upper part of the panel here is basically the visual representation of a 4-compound mixture. Every mixture is at a level where it's still safe, so it doesn't fill what we call the risk cup completely. The risk cup is just a visual representation or an image that gives you an idea about the total amount of a chemical or of a risk that you are willing to tolerate, however we estimate that. So each of those 4 chemicals taken individually, and that's what REACH is doing most of the time, that is safe. And now the problem is, when we are adding things together, then you enter into the realm of the mixture problem, and then we have a situation where safe use, or we have not a situation where we can exclude that there is a risk. So the question is, what do we do about that? And the only way to do that is to actually make sure that this risk cup is not overflowing, and that we basically are staying within the, you could also call that a boundary, the carrying capacity. People have been talking about critical loads and levels a couple of decades back, etc. So we have to stay within that boundary so that the risk cup doesn't overflow. So as soon as I'm done here with sharing my screen, I'll just put the PDF of that paper into the chat so that you have that directly. It's unfortunately not open access, but it's just something for you to read up if you're interested. So we're talking about the mixture assessment factor and the mixture allocation factor. And the critical thing here is we need to be really sure, what do we mean by that? People keep using that word, and I'm pretty sure that it doesn't mean what they think it means. So the Princess Bride here is really a good guiding principle. So let me just walk you through some mock-up study and then some real case study so that we can actually see what does that mean, what does that imply. So let's assume we have a mixture here of 10 compounds. Each of those are in at a concentration that is safe. This is the risk characterization ratio, which basically means at a ratio of 1, the substance is exactly at the maximum concentration that is still safe for that individual compound under the assumption that nothing else is there. We have substance 2 and substance 3 that are at a quarter of their individually maximum concentration. And then we have a lot of compounds that are there, but at very, very small risk contribution levels only. And that's a very typical pattern. You have very few compounds that are really driving things, that are really contributing a lot. And then you have a lot of compounds where the analytical chemists are happy to measure that, but they don't really add to the overall mixture. So in this case, we have a risk characterization ratio of the total mixture of 1.6, which basically means the concentration of the mixture is 1.6 times higher than what we find acceptable. So the question is, how do we get rid of that? The MAF, as we have it now, is 1.0, which basically means there's nothing there. The MAF doesn't exist, it's 1. And now we start to think about, okay, how can we handle that mixture in order to get the whole sum into the value of 1. So we say, okay, the MAF of 1 obviously doesn't work, so we have to start squeezing the mixture components, the risk contributions together. So we start doing that. We start moving that down to 0.9. Still no change. We still have 1.6. Now we go down to 0.8. Still the same. It's still 1.6. And now we're starting to cut into the individual components, but we are starting to cut those components that really matter. It's really important to realize that we are not touching any of those low-risk compounds, the ones on the right-hand side of the screen that don't really add to the overall mixture. But it's still not enough. We have been lowering the risk quotient from 1.6 to 1.5. Not good enough. We continue to move downwards, 1.4. 1.0. And if we're at 1.0, we have the mixture concentration at exactly the level that is just the maximum that is still safe, under the assumption that simple additivity is really the way to go. And again, we have a lot of data that support that. And what we're seeing here is that substance 1 really needs to be taken care of. We need to cut away a lot of that. We need to cut a tiny bit for substances 2 and 3, and all the others are basically not affected at all by the implementation of that MAF. So we are inherently focusing on those compounds that matter, and we leave the others in peace, because additional risk assessments, risk mitigation measures for those compounds wouldn't really change the outcome because their contribution is so little. Here's just an example from the human health area. That's real data that are based on male sperm quality in humans. The exposure data are from HBM. Sorry, I'm missing HBM4EU, where we have been looking at concentrations in urine. The data are provided by Professor Andreas Kortenkamp from Brunel University, 29 chemicals, and we're looking just at the average exposure across the European population. And if you just start looking at the individual compounds, then this is the picture that you're getting. Again, here on the y-axis, we have the risk quotients. Remember, a value of 1 means concentration is as high as the maximum safe level. So 1 is just on the fringe of what is acceptable. And here we have a sum of all of that of 15, which basically means the total concentration of endocrine disrupting chemicals is 15 times higher on average than what we think is acceptable. But again, we see exactly what I've shown you with a mock-up mixture just a couple of minutes ago. We see that there are a couple of compounds that are really driving things forward and that are really causing the problem. In this case, it's bisphenol A. And now you would be saying, yeah, hang on, wait a second. If bisphenol A is present at a concentration that is almost 13 times higher than the safe level, I don't care about the mixtures. We should be looking at bisphenol A. That's the critical compound that we get rid of, and there are a lot of restrictions already in place. So hopefully the concentrations are going down. We see that already in water, so that will also happen in the human body. So why don't we focus on bisphenol A? Yeah, and that's definitely the right and the good way forward. That's the necessary first step. If we do that, we end up in that situation. Now we have a situation where bisphenol A is just present at its maximum tolerable concentration, which basically means we now have the situation that each individual compound is present at an individually safe level. But the problem is, if we're starting to add that up, we still have an almost 4 times higher total concentration than what we think is acceptable under the assumption of additivity. So we still need to do something, although this one here would be where we are basically fulfilling all the requirements, the legal demands that we have in our current legal frameworks. If we apply the MAF, then we are getting something like that. So we are getting, we are starting again to squeeze down from the top to squeeze away those compounds that really matter. If I just go back 1 second, it's still bisphenol A, but here we have brominated flame retardants, bisphenol S and F, which obviously are the substitution compounds for bisphenol A. So we have to take that into consideration, that their concentrations are currently increasing. But if we apply the MAF, then these are the safe levels that we find acceptable. This is what we are aiming for. This is not a reflection of the real world situation. The real world situation will again look differently, but this is basically the aim that we're having when we're implementing the MAF. Remember, at the moment, the legal aim is that all these boxes are at exactly 1. So we have a very straight line, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's what we are accepting now. And with a MAF, in this case, with a MAF of 11, we would be just accepting 1/10 of that, or 1/11 of that. So that would be then the new safe level. But then we are making room for all the other compounds that all share the same risk cup. So that's the general idea here. So just quick summary. I think one thing that is really clearly clear, and that is the stuff that really motivates all of that, without considering the reality of mixed exposure, we will never even get close to a non-toxic environment. We will not fulfill the non-toxic ambition, or whatever other phrase we have invented for that. We will not get there if we don't start to act on the fact that we are exposed to chemical mixtures. We have concentration addition that works, that is available. We know how to use that. But again, the problem is we have quite substantial data demands that are not always fulfilled. So the question is, are there any shortcuts that we can take? And the MAF is definitely a rule of thumb that we can use for doing that. I think it's really, really critical, again, that we know what we're talking about. The MAF is an allocation factor, not an assessment factor. An assessment factor is something where if you provide more data, you can lower the assessment factor. That's the typical tiered approach that we have in chemical risk assessment. But given that the MAF is driven by the co-exposure pattern, that means that even if you have very good data, you can't lower that factor because the other compounds are still there. And that's a fundamental difference to the typical assessment factors that you have. That's why it's an allocation factor. It characterizes how much space you devote for every chemical. It's exactly the same thing that we're doing when we're looking at climate change impacts, when we're basically attributing the global warming potential of different gases, and then we're saying our risk cup is 1.5 degrees global warming, and now it's a certain amount of carbon dioxide that we are accepting there, a certain amount of methane, a certain amount of F gases, etc. But they are all sharing the same atmosphere. That's the same idea that we're having here. It's a tool for risk management, not for risk assessment. So the risk assessment, the procedures that we have for assessing the risk of individual compounds is the basis for estimating an appropriate size of the MAF and then to continue, but we are not trying to replace that. It's just for risk management. You're basically then comparing the outcome of the risk assessment to a smaller fraction of the total risk cup that you are setting aside for every chemical. So it's especially made for data poor situations. If we have better data, then of course you should be using more precise instruments. This is just the last exit. We know that there is a problem, but we can't wait until we have all the data that we would like to have. We need to start doing something now. It's compatible with the current regulatory approaches. It doesn't change the PNEC, the DNL, or any other regulatory threshold. It also does not change, obviously, the PEG. But at the same time, just thinking about mixtures is also deeply incompatible with current regulatory approaches. REACH or the pesticide regulations, all those frameworks are set up with the idea there is a company that has to demonstrate safe use and then they are good to go. Doesn't matter that there are neighboring companies that are using the same emission space, the same safe emission space. And that is where we really have to change our thinking in order to go towards a non-toxic environment. So because this is driven by co-exposure patterns, this is the implementation of the MAF is really a challenge for regulatory authorities, either on a European or on a member state level, because they are the ones who have the best overview of which chemicals are on the market, how the market is changing, what are current developments. You can't ask that from individual companies. That is a task for the people that have the bigger overview. So yeah, it's a challenge for regulatory authorities. And now I'm finished. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.